For more than 5 centuries, the world has believed that Richard III was a monster, a child killer, a tyrant, and a malformed usurper who stole England's throne through murder. His name became synonymous with cruelty. His image, shaped by chroniclers and immortalized by Shakespeare, turned him into one of history's most infamous villains. But what if that image was deliberately manufactured? What if the Richard III we think we know never existed? This is England's oldest unresolved disappearance. 2 boys, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, vanished inside the safest fortress in the kingdom. There were no bodies, no verified sightings, no documented eyewitnesses of their final moments. Yet almost immediately, public opinion, later echoed by historians, pointed to a single suspect, Richard III. For centuries, that accusation went mostly unchallenged. The case was accepted as fact because no one confronted the missing evidence. The absence of proof slowly became the foundation of certainty, and the disappearance of the princes became the cornerstone of Richard's reputation as a murderer. But in 2012, everything changed. When archaeologists uncovered Richard III's remains under a parking lot in Leicester, scientific analysis collided with 500 years of narrative. The skeleton displayed scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but nothing resembling the grotesque physical deformity described in Tudor-era texts or Shakespeare's play. The discovery did not prove innocence, but it proved fabrication. Someone at some point had reshaped his body in the public imagination to fit a predetermined villain. And then came the deeper question. If the physical description was political propaganda, what else might have been distorted? To answer that, we must look at the political landscape that followed Richard's death. After he fell at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Henry Tudor claimed the throne as Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. This dynasty had a direct interest in portraying Richard as illegitimate and evil. If Richard III had been a lawful and competent king, then Henry Tudor had overthrown a rightful monarch. That was unacceptable for a new and unstable regime. So the Tudors began to reshape history. Records favorable to Richard were minimized or destroyed. Chroniclers connected to the new monarchy wrote narratives framing him as a tyrant and the murderer of his nephews. Decades later, these stories formed the basis of Shakespeare's Richard III, a play written under Tudor rule that permanently fused political bias with cultural memory. But none of this answers the core historical question. Who actually created the myth of Richard III the monster? Who possessed not only the motive, but the power to replace ambiguity with certainty? To understand that, we must return to the late 15th century, to the final years of the Wars of the Roses, a civil conflict not just between armies, but between competing narratives. In this era, history was not a record of facts. It was a weapon. And the people who controlled the outcome of the war controlled the story that followed. The disappearance of the princes, the rapid collapse of Richard's regime, and the rise of the Tudors created the perfect environment for a myth to bloom. Each unanswered question became an accusation. Each political victory became a justification. Little by little, the historical figure of Richard III was buried under layers of interpretation, assumption, and state-driven storytelling. What remains today is not a portrait, but a distortion, a mixture of truth and invention, and separating one from the other requires examining every piece of evidence without accepting Tudor-era conclusions as fact. This is the real story of Richard III. Not the villain taught in classrooms, not the hero proposed by revisionists, but a figure caught between the truth of his actions and a dynasty determined to erase him. Richard III, born Richard of Gloucester, was not expected to become king. He was the youngest surviving brother of Edward IV, a dominant Yorkist ruler whose military victories had restored his family's power during the Wars of the Roses. Richard's early life was shaped entirely by conflict. From childhood, he moved through military camps, political negotiations, and shifting alliances. By his teenage years, he had already learned that in England's civil war, survival required loyalty, competence, and control. As an adult, Richard demonstrated all three. He became one of Edward IV's most effective commanders. On the battlefield, he was disciplined rather than reckless. In governance, he earned a reputation for strict but consistent justice. In the north of England, where lawlessness and noble rivalries were constant problems, Richard built enduring support. Contemporary records describe him as fair, accessible, and unafraid to intervene in disputes involving powerful families. For many Northerners, he was not merely Edward IV's brother. He was the one royal authority they trusted to act without favoritism. But this stability ended abruptly in April 1483, when Edward IV died without warning. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old. England faced a familiar problem, a minor ascending the throne during a period of deep political division. By the late 15th century, Royal minorities often led to power struggles, factional manipulation, and instability. The realm needed a protector, someone to manage the government until the boy could rule. By Edward IV's will and the custom of the time, that position fell to Richard of Gloucester. Initially, the arrangement appeared temporary and uncontroversial. The young king was brought toward London, and Richard prepared to meet him. But within weeks, the political situation changed dramatically. A faction centered around the Woodville family, relatives of the deceased king's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, attempted to seize control of the government and isolate the young king from Richard. The Woodvilles had long been viewed with suspicion by the older nobility and many in the north. Their swift attempt to centralize power after Edward IV's death triggered immediate resistance. Richard responded decisively. He intercepted the procession of the young king, took custody of Edward V, and arrested several Woodville allies. The queen fled into sanctuary with her younger son, the Duke of York. Richard framed his actions as necessary to protect the crown from a faction attempting to rule through a minor. His opponents viewed the same events as a calculated power grab. Then came the turning point. While reviewing the legality of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, Richard's supporters uncovered, or claimed to uncover, evidence of a prior betrothal by Edward IV. Under canon law, this would make his marriage invalid and his children, including the two princes, illegitimate. If the princes were illegitimate, they could not inherit the throne. Parliament agreed. Richard was declared the rightful king, and he took the crown as Richard III. Legally, the process followed established procedure. The succession was altered not by force but by statute, through the document known as Titulus Regius. But legality does not prevent political fallout. To those who supported the Woodvilles or distrusted Richard, the sequence of events looked engineered. Richard becoming protector, taking custody of the heir, exposing a marriage irregularity, and ascending the throne himself. It created a narrative that opponents could use later, that Richard III had positioned himself for power and might remove anyone standing between him and the throne. Shortly after Richard's coronation, the two princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were moved to the Tower of London. At the time, this was a standard location for royal wards awaiting ceremonial events, not necessarily a prison. But when the princes were no longer seen publicly, rumors spread rapidly. This sequence, the legal declaration of illegitimacy, the abrupt transfer of the princes to the Tower, and Richard's ascension, formed the basis of the accusation that would dominate his legacy, the claim that he eliminated his nephews to secure the throne. Whether that accusation was justified or politically weaponized remains central to the controversy surrounding Richard III. What is clear is that Richard's rise to power provided fertile ground for suspicion, and his enemies later had every incentive to reinterpret each decision as part of a calculated plan. Richard III became king through legal channels, but the circumstances made him vulnerable to a narrative that would outlive him. The story of a man who seized the crown and removed the heirs who stood in his way. Richard III's reputation hinges on a single event: the disappearance of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, the young princes of the House of York. Their vanishing inside the Tower of London became one of the most enduring mysteries in English history, and for centuries, Richard III was accused of eliminating them to secure the throne. But the available evidence tells a far more complicated story. At the time of their disappearance, the princes were not prisoners. They were lodged in the Tower of London because tradition required future kings to reside there before their coronation. The Tower served simultaneously as fortress, treasury, royal residence, and administrative center. Placing the boys there in 1483 was routine procedure. Then, the records fall silent. The princes were last seen in late summer. After that point, no official documents referenced their movements, health, or ceremonial preparations. The absence of information became a vacuum quickly filled by rumor. Soon afterward, foreign diplomats reported hearing speculation that the boys were dead. Local gossip moved faster than official channels, and within months, Richard III, now king, was widely assumed to be responsible. But when historians examined the surviving sources closely, the foundations of that accusation collapse. There are no eyewitness accounts of the princes' deaths. There is no written order from Richard III commanding their removal. There is no confession, no testimony, no contemporary investigation. And crucially, there are no identified bodies that can conclusively be proven to belong to the princes. Later discoveries, such as the bones found in 1674, remain inconclusive without modern genetic testing, which has not been permitted. In any other true crime investigation, the absence of physical evidence, direct testimony, or official records would prevent any clear verdict. Yet Richard III became the primary suspect. Why? The simplest explanation offered by Tudor-era historians was motive. Richard III clearly benefited from their disappearance. With the princes gone, his claim to the throne faced no immediate Yorkist challengers. But the argument rests on an assumption, that eliminating the princes guaranteed Richard's political stability. The reality is more complex. By late 1483, Richard's authority was contested by multiple factions. If he had wished to strengthen his position, removing the princes quietly would have been an extraordinarily risky strategy. Accusations of child murder, even unproven, carried immense political cost. Indeed, rumors about the prince's fate damaged Richard more than any surviving evidence suggests he anticipated. Moreover, Richard III was not the only figure with motive. Other political actors stood to gain as much, or more, from the prince's disappearance. Chief among them was Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant with a weak hereditary claim but strong backing from exiled nobles. For Henry to seize the throne, the sons of Edward IV had to be disqualified, legally, politically, or physically. Henry Tudor, however, was not in England during the disappearance. He was in Brittany gathering support, but his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was in England and deeply involved in conspiracies aimed at overthrowing Richard III. Her network of allies had access to key political centers and could have acted independently of her son. If the princes were removed by Richard III, it benefited Henry Tudor. If they were removed by Henry's supporters, it benefited Henry Tudor even more. The absence of evidence pointing to Richard III does not prove his innocence, but the same lack of evidence fails to implicate him convincingly. The crime, if it occurred, remains unattributed. What is clear is that when Richard III died in battle in 1485, the narrative surrounding the princes changed rapidly. After his victory at Bosworth, Henry Tudor became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. Under his rule, the story hardened into certainty. The princes were dead, and Richard III was the murderer. Documents were rewritten, Yorkist accounts suppressed, and chroniclers shaped the narrative in favor of the new king. By the early 1500s, the accusation had transformed from rumor into accepted historical fact, without new evidence emerging. This shift did not reflect the discovery of proof. It reflected the political needs of a newly established dynasty. The disappearance of the princes remains unsolved, but the speed with which the blame attached to Richard III, despite the absence of forensic, documentary, or eyewitness evidence, tells us more about Tudor propaganda than about Richard himself. And the question at the center of this case remains unanswered. Were the princes victims of Richard III, or of the political machine that replaced him? Richard III's reputation today is not the product of evidence. It is the result of a systematic transformation that began the moment Henry Tudor defeated him at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. To legitimize his rule, Henry Tudor, soon crowned Henry VII, needed to do more than win a battle. He needed to redefine the past. If Richard III had been a lawful, competent king, then Henry Tudor had overthrown a legitimate monarch. That was politically dangerous for a new ruler with a fragile hereditary claim. So the Tudor regime took control of the narrative. Immediately after taking power, Henry VII began altering the official record. Parliamentary acts under Richard were reversed. Pro-Yorkist accounts disappeared. Clerks rewrote, amended, or destroyed documents that could cast doubt on Henry's legitimacy. The goal was simple: turn Richard III into a monster so that Henry Tudor could appear as England's savior. The most important step was suppressing Titulus Regius, the legal statute that had declared Edward IV's children illegitimate and validated Richard III's accession. Henry VII ordered every copy burned. Possession of the document was treated as sedition. Erasing this law allowed the Tudors to claim that Richard III had no lawful basis for taking the throne, even though the act had passed through Parliament. Next came the creation of a moral narrative. Chroniclers writing under Tudor patronage depicted Richard as a tyrant, a usurper, and the murderer of his nephews. These writers rarely provided evidence. Instead, they relied on insinuation, rhetoric, and repetition. In the absence of contradictory Yorkist sources, now destroyed or suppressed, their accounts became the default version of events. By the early 16th century, the official Tudor story had hardened. Richard III was deformed in body and mind, a villain whose removal had been necessary for national stability. This portrait did not emerge from new discoveries. It emerged from political necessity. But the most influential blow to Richard III's reputation came decades later, during the reign of Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch. In this environment, William Shakespeare wrote his play, Richard III. Shakespeare's portrayal was vividly memorable, a hunchbacked figure driven by malice, deceit, and unrelenting ambition. The character was designed for drama, not accuracy, yet it became the dominant image of Richard III for the next 400 years. Shakespeare worked in a political context that rewarded alignment with Tudor ideology. His depiction amplified the narrative created by Henry VII's propagandists, not the historical evidence. As a result, audiences from the 1590s onward absorbed a fictionalized Richard III as if he were a factual reconstruction. For centuries, this theatrical version shaped education, literature, and popular culture. School children learned about Richard III not through archival records, but through Shakespeare's script. The distinction between documented history and Tudor political storytelling slowly disappeared. Then in 2012, Richard III's skeleton was uncovered beneath a car park in Leicester. Scientific analysis revealed that he suffered from scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but did not match the grotesque deformities described in Tudor-era accounts. The discovery proved that one of the core features of Richard's villainous image had been fabricated. The hunchback, the twisted arm, the monstrous posture, none aligned with forensic evidence. This raised an unavoidable question. If the Tudors lied about his body, how much else did they distort? The answer lies in the consistency of the pattern. For generations, Tudor narratives were taught as if they were objective truth. Chroniclers wrote what the monarchy needed. Shakespeare dramatized it. Historians repeated it. By the time later scholars began challenging the story, the myths were already embedded in culture. The power of Tudor propaganda was not in its accuracy, but in its endurance. By controlling the narrative, the Tudors ensured that Richard III's name would be associated with murder, tyranny, and deformity, regardless of evidence. They succeeded so completely that even modern audiences often accept the Tudor version without realizing its origins. Richard III's historical reputation, therefore, is not a reflection of proven actions. It is the product of a dynasty shaping memory to justify its existence. After examining the evidence, the political context, and the manipulation that followed his death, a final question remains. Who was Richard III beneath the layers of Tudor propaganda? Richard III was unquestionably ambitious. He operated in a political environment defined by conflict, instability, and shifting loyalties. Conditions in which hesitation was dangerous and decisive action was often the only path to survival. He was shaped by decades of civil war. Everyone who rose to power during the Wars of the Roses did so through strategy, alliances, and force. In that context, Richard's actions were neither unusual nor exceptional. They were consistent with the behavior of other magnates navigating a violent political landscape. But ambition alone does not define his reign. When historians examine Richard III's government, they find a pattern that contradicts the later Tudor portrayal of a ruthless tyrant. Richard expanded legal access for ordinary people by strengthening the Court of Requests, a venue specifically designed to allow the poor to seek justice against powerful local figures. He instituted measures to curb corruption within the judicial system, issuing directives to ensure that sheriffs and judges operated with greater accountability. He supported trade by protecting merchants from extortion and by stabilizing regional disputes that threaten commercial routes. None of these policies align with the image of a king indifferent to fairness or public welfare. Instead, they suggest a reform-minded ruler focused on administrative order. This does not mean Richard III was a moral idealist. It means the record shows a far more complex figure than the villain constructed by his successors. Richard's downfall came not from internal collapse, but from a single military confrontation. At the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he faced the invading forces of Henry Tudor. According to contemporary sources, Richard did not attempt to flee as the battle turned against him. Instead, he launched a direct charge toward Henry Tudor himself, an extremely rare action for a reigning monarch, and one that demonstrated a willingness to fight to the last moment rather than retreat. Richard died on the field, surrounded by enemies. His death ended the Plantagenet line that had ruled England for more than 3 centuries. It also ended independent control over how his story would be told. Once Henry Tudor became Henry VII, the narrative shifted immediately. Richard III's choices as king, his reforms, and even his physical appearance were reinterpreted to justify the new regime. The accusation that he murdered his nephews became central to Henry's moral and political legitimacy. And because Richard died in battle, he had no opportunity to defend his actions or leave behind statements that could counter the Tudor narrative. Today, historians approach the disappearance of the princes not as a settled fact, but as an open question. There is no definitive evidence that Richard III killed them. There is no definitive evidence that he ordered anyone else to do so. And there is clear evidence that later accounts were shaped by Tudor political needs rather than documented truth. Modern scholarship recognizes that the information available from the period is incomplete, often biased, and frequently altered after Richard's death. As a result, his historical reputation cannot be separated from the influence of Tudor propaganda. In 2012, Richard III's remains were reburied at Leicester Cathedral after extensive scientific analysis confirmed his identity. The rediscovery of his body did more than provide forensic data. It forced historians and the public to reassess long-held assumptions. The skeleton revealed scoliosis, but no monstrous deformity. This discovery, combined with renewed examination of primary sources, has accelerated efforts to reconstruct a more accurate view of the last Yorkist king. The truth as it currently stands is neither a full exoneration nor a confirmation of guilt. It is a recognition that the traditional story is incomplete, distorted, and shaped by those who defeated him. 5 centuries later, the evidence continues to evolve. Richard III may not have been an innocent man, but the villain the world was taught to fear was never real.